Okay, we're set.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Tobias, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very new to UC system in general and UC Irvine and UC A&R in particular, but I'm very excited to be here and to hopefully meet all of you in the very near future. So I just started September 1st, and so I'll be talking a lot about my past work rather than current work in California because I just started 2 months ago. And I'll start out my presentation by posing that people and water have a very complicated relationship, which I'm sure everyone in this webinar is aware of. So our earliest civilizations developed in river floodplains. The proximity to water provided these early civilizations with drinking water, with irrigation water for agriculture. Water is life, and so humans have always developed cities historically on river floodplains. And Southern California is no exception. So I'm located in Orange County, where there are a large number of creeks. And we're situated right next to the ocean. But in modern times, we have a great deal of urbanization in these watersheds and a great deal of modifications to how water is cycled through the environment in this urbanized space. So one major difference that emerges in the water cycle in urban areas is this linearity of water flow in cities. So water is pulled out for drinking water purposes. It's used in the urban space, and then it's discarded of typically back into waterways as wastewater. In Orange County, this cycle this loop is actually being closed a little bit, where uh, wastewater is actually sort of being recycled back into groundwater. Typically in cities, this doesn't happen. Wastewater is lost to surface water, and drinking water usually has to be pulled from a completely different part of the landscape, somewhere where it won't be suffering from poor water quality. So usually in conservation areas in the headwaters of the watershed. Another alteration, of course, is the infrastructure within cities. So we have a lot of impervious surfaces that can cause flooding when it rains. This is, of course, linked also to water quality. So the stormwater entrains water pollutants and delivers it into the watershed. So we have water quantity and quality issues that you can already see emerging from urban development. And then, of course, we have socioeconomic inequalities that create vulnerable communities that are disproportionately affected by environmental hazards like poor water quality and flooding, particularly among populations of unhoused people or people who are living in houses that have poor infrastructure for dealing with flooding or maybe even introduce particular water quality issues. And of course, all of this is worsened by climate change. So with extreme weather comes increased flooding, increased problems with water quality, and increased disproportionate impacts on marginalized communities. So the focus of my work for a long time now has been on what we call nature-based solutions. So these are solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, that produce ecosystem services, which are benefits that the natural environment provides to humans, but also build resilience to things like climate change and urbanization. So the focus of my work has been predominantly in the aquatic sphere. I've worked a lot on nature-based solutions that are akin to wetlands or wetland features. So restored marshes has been a big focus of my work in my most recent position, which was in New York City. I was faculty there for 7 years. But I've also looked at how street trees can mitigate flooding, for example, and potentially improve water quality in the urban environment. And these nature-based solutions are a really important component of restoring benefits that were lost when natural environments were converted to urban landscape, as well as, again, increasing resilience to climate change impacts into the future. So my talk today is really going to be a tale of two metro regions where I focus on nature-based solutions that I've studied in those environments. So I'll abbreviate nature-based solutions to NBS in future slides. But the main focus of my research over the last couple of decades is the control on the kinds of controls in the urban environment on the inputs of nutrients and microbial pollution in particular in urban watersheds. Um, Also examining when management of nature-based solutions is useful and when it isn't so useful. And then finally, how nature-based solutions can provide ecosystem services or benefits or even disservices or harms to vulnerable communities experiencing environmental stressors. And so the metro regions I'll be focusing on are Phoenix, Arizona, the Phoenix metro region where I did my postdoctoral work, and the New York metro region where I did my graduate work and then again worked as faculty for 7 years prior to moving here. Um, I've also been doing, this is my first extension position, but up until this point, I've been doing a lot of what I call extension adjacent work. So this position was a very natural and welcome, I feel, development in my career trajectory, because I have been looking at questions about not only these water quantity and quality issues, and how nature-based solutions can potentially mitigate them, but also how this plays out in terms of the communities where these nature-based solutions are potentially situated. So the questions that I have been investigating and I want to continue to investigate are: how do we develop more informed community decision-making around managing urban water quality and quantity? How do we ensure that management and policy decisions reflect the uses, values, and desires of the communities where we are, again, potentially introducing nature-based solutions or managing water in particular ways? And then finally, how can we manage urban environments to minimize harm and maximize benefit and access for vulnerable communities? So these are sort of the outreach and extension components of the research questions that I presented earlier. So I'll talk first about work that I've done around identifying the inputs of nutrients and microbial pollution in urban watersheds. And uh, this this requires maybe a little bit of background on why we are concerned about nutrient pollution. Probably, again, most of the people at this webinar are aware of the impacts of nutrient pollution, but excess nutrients can cause eutrophication in waterways. So basically, the nutrients serve as a fertilizer for these large algal blooms, and we see this in Southern California as well. So these are algal blooms reported in Newport Bay in 2021 that were coming from nitrogen in treated sewage and stormwater. The algal blooms can contain toxins. They can also deprive the water column of oxygen as the algae decomposes. And so this has huge impacts on wildlife and, of course, on people utilizing the waterways as well. For either drinking water or bathing. And then we also see some problems of nitrate contamination of groundwater. So this can become a human health concern if nitrate gets above a certain level. And this often happens in areas that have a great deal of fertilizer application or a legacy of fertilizer application. And we're starting to see groundwater contamination of nitrate emerging in urban areas as well, particularly urban areas that are surrounded by a lot of agriculture. So in Southern California, the growing problem of groundwater nitrate contamination is actually primarily being seen in cities and in low-income communities that are relying on groundwater for drinking water. So nitrogen has a lot of potential sources in urban environments. Treated wastewater and untreated sewage are a large source because animal waste contains high levels of inorganic nitrogen. Fossil fuel combustion could be a source of nitrogen. I mentioned fertilizer application as well, which is often used on particularly turf in urban areas. And then leaves from street trees can actually be a major source of nitrogen as well. There's been some interesting work in the Twin Cities in Minnesota showing that leaf pack is significantly leaching nitrogen into the urban lakes that are located in the Twin Cities. In the Northeast, which is again where I did my PhD work and worked as a professor, there is a combined sewer overflow system that is particularly problematic in terms of degrading water quality. So in older cities like New York City, the stormwater and wastewater pipes are one combined system. And during dry weather, the wastewater that's coming out of households is gravity fed to a wastewater treatment plant. And, you know, all of the wastewater that's being generated domestically is being treated at a wastewater treatment plant. But during a heavy rainfall event, there's the additional water input from the storm drains that are combined with the wastewater system. And the pipes exceed their capacity. So basically the volume exceeds the capacity that the pipes can handle, and the water overflows into nearby waterways. So you can imagine the myriad contaminants that would be affiliated with this untreated wastewater entering surrounding waterways. And so, you know, pathogens for sure, bacteria, microbial pollution, as well as a lot of nutrients and predominantly nitrogen. So an undergraduate student, Paris Baker, did her honors thesis with me, examining what the primary sources of nitrogen pollution were in this urban watershed of Newtown Creek in New York City, and found that that predominantly we have raw sewage and treated wastewater as sources of nitrogen in this watershed. And identifying sources is, you know, a really important thing to do if we're going to mitigate nitrogen pollution. And, you know, typically a budgetary approach is a really good way of trying to identify potential sources. So there are these long-term monitoring data sets that are demonstrating that nitrogen levels are incredibly high in the waterways surrounding New York City. But in order to design targeted campaigns to try to mitigate this nitrogen pollution, we really need to know where it's coming from. And so this budgetary approach was extremely useful in demonstrating that some sort of nature-based solutions around minimizing the amount of stormwater that's going into the combined sewer system, as well as having some sort of maybe marshes or other nature-based solutions actually situated in the waterway to treat the treated wastewater for additional nitrogen removal. So this budgetary approach can be extremely useful in figuring out what kinds of nature-based solutions we need to think about and where it needs to be situated in the watershed. I've also used monitoring campaigns to try to figure out what some of the major drivers of nitrogen loading are in cities. And so this is a long-term data set that I collected in Phoenix, Arizona, again, showing this very important tie between climate and weather, particularly extreme events, and pollution loading in the watersheds. So here on the top graph, we see the precipitation and discharge record in the Salt River, which is the system where I was studying wetlands. So there are these stormwater pipes that drain into the mostly dry bed of the Salt River and create these wetland environments. And so based on the water samples that we were collecting in the stormwater pipes, we see that pollution levels increase by orders of magnitude following a storm event, particularly after a prolonged dry periods. And so this has very important implications. I'll point out also that this E. coli graph has a log scale on the left-hand side. So you can imagine just how incredibly different the contamination levels are depending on whether you're in dry or wet conditions. But it really is this juxtaposition of extreme events. So like, for example, prolonged drought, followed by extreme rainfall that can really exacerbate pollution to urban waterways. And so here we see a record from the Baltimore ecosystem long-term ecological research project where they were monitoring various urbanized watersheds as well as a reference forested watershed. You can see that particularly in the urban watersheds, the juxtaposition of extreme events, so a record drought followed by a tropical storm, just really triggers an extreme amount of nitrogen loading to those urban watersheds. And in a forested, non-urbanized setting, this may be buffered sufficiently so that we do not see this problem emerging. But we see from this long-term record how how closely tied climate change is to water quantity and quality issues in these urbanized watersheds in a way that we don't see in more quote unquote natural ecosystems. So so things like drought and extreme precipitation in the Northeast, combined with urban infrastructure and the land use and land change that we see in an urbanized setting, is really kind of conspiring to create additional water quality problems. And then we actually see, even though we're in a completely different region of the US with a very different climate, similar drivers of water pollution problems in an urban setting. So prolonged dry periods, extreme drought, and extreme precipitation, both of which are predicted to increase in frequency and extremity in the Southwest. We see drive also these pulses of pollution, both of nutrients and of pathogens in the case of my monitoring data set. So I mentioned earlier that I've been interested, I've been undertaking these extension adjacent activities around these data sets. And my colleague and I at Pace University, which is where I was based before coming to UC Irvine, were really interested in not just monitoring water quality, but also really developing more informed community decision-making around managing water quantity and quality issues by really evaluating what community perceptions around water quality are. So we conducted some surveys and some studies in Coney Island Creek, which is in southern Brooklyn in New York City. And the surveys actually indicated that there was a high concern among the community in terms of water pollution by disease-causing organisms. But what was interesting was that the perceptions weren't really matching the uses because in the same survey that we conducted, people were reporting that they were actually conducting activities such as swimming or fishing in the waterways that sort of contradicted the concern that people had over disease-causing organisms in the water. We also observed a lot of people who who were fishing and bathing and so forth in these highly polluted waterways. So people were kind of split on how safe they felt it was to swim, and this really points to an important need for not just water quality monitoring, but also the need to transmit that water quality monitoring and the findings to users of those waterways so that they can utilize them in more safe ways with safer activities. We also have done a lot of work with my colleague and I with citizen science. So citizen science is the collection and analysis of environmental data by members of the general public, typically in collaboration with professional scientists. And we were working closely with the Billion Oyster Project, which is a project that is aiming to restore 1 billion oysters to New York City waterways. But they do have these water quality scientists who work as volunteers for their program. And we have done a program assessment with them as well, where we found some very encouraging evidence that there was higher literacy, engagement, and optimism around environmental issues among the volunteers that were volunteering more frequently. So even volunteers who had volunteered for the first time did show some evidence of improvement around environmental literacy and optimism. So this is very encouraging, and I think a way that we can again get people more engaged and informed around what's happening with waterways in urban areas. Okay, so I want to move next to another area of my research, which is around management of nature-based solutions and the extent to which it's useful or potentially not useful. So just to give a little bit of background on the main type of nature-based solution that I usually examine, which is urban wetlands. Urban wetlands are typically identified as an important nature-based solution in terms of addressing both water quality and quantity problems because they're capable of dissipating water energy and storing water, but also through various microbial processes that are unique to wetlands are able to sequester carbon, contaminants, nutrients, etc. And then there are, of course, additional cultural ecosystem services like recreation, aesthetic value, and other types of cultural ties that people have with wetlands. So many of you may be familiar with a few different categories of wetlands, namely like remnant wetlands, which are wetlands that are persist past urbanization in an urban environment. So they were a wetland before the city came and then sort of persisted as urbanization proceeded. And then we also have restored and constructed wetlands in urban areas that are meant to sort of replace or rehabilitate wetlands that were lost in the urbanization process. In my work, however, I identified a new category of urban wetland, which I termed accidental wetland, and I published a paper on this in 2017 about this unique category of wetland that we find in urban areas. So accidental wetlands are wetlands that emerge from human use, but are not deliberately designed to be in the landscape. So they have all the characteristics to delineate them as wetlands. They have wetland soils, they have wetland plants, they have wetland hydrology, but they are novel ecosystems. In other words, their soils, plants, and water sources reflect urban practices and human decision-making in the urban watershed. So they do result from human activities in that the plants, water, and soils often come directly from humans and human development, but they're not designed or managed to be wetlands. They just happen to be an abandoned part of the landscape where water was redirected, and once water was added, then wetland soil processes and plant communities emerged. In my work, I found that they tend to be around in basically every city worldwide, I would say, but they're very understudied. It's very difficult to identify the history or source of a wetland, and so there may be a lot of accidental wetlands that we may not even be aware are accidental in the urban landscape. So I've been very interested in my work since I was a graduate student in looking at uh, how these sort of interventions or lack of intervention result in potential benefits or harms to humans in the urban landscape. Um, so we have this gradient of intervention from low to high, where remnant and accidental wetlands aren't really intervened on very much by humans. But constructed wetlands are just completely emergent from human design and conception. So there's a high degree of intervention or meddling on the part of humans in constructed wetlands. Um, so on the one hand, it could be that constructed wetlands are very highly beneficial and functional compared to accidental wetlands because they're actually explicitly designed and managed to provide particular types of benefits like aesthetics, like nutrient removal, etc. So perhaps constructed wetlands provide more benefits, and each benefit is delivered at a higher rate than wetlands that are not intervened on and are, basically products of or remnants that exist within the urban environment and are highly altered as a result. On the other hand, though, these wetlands that have a low degree of human intervention are also more self-organized ecologically. So there may be actually even higher function because the plants and the soil processes and the microbes have kind of organically, from lack of a better word, organized into a wetland ecosystem. So maybe this is a more functional environment than one that is highly designed and managed by humans to be a certain thing in the landscape. So, so these are two potential hypotheses of how these different wetland types compare to one another, and I've been interested to see which kind of emerges from the wetlands that I've studied. So I mentioned earlier that that wetland environments are capable of removing contaminants. The process that I've studied the most is microbial denitrification, which is a microbial process that happens under low oxygen environments that we find in wetland environments also, which are low oxygen because of the presence of standing water on the soil. So in these types of environments, we do find that nitrate, which is what the source of that eutrophication and all kinds of environmental problems, is converted by microbes into mostly inert or harmless nitrogen gas. So this is a process that naturally occurs in wetlands. It provides significant benefit in removing nitrogen pollution. And because wetlands are often situated between these upland urban environments and adjacent waterways, they're a good receptacle potentially for contaminated stormwater and wastewater and can reduce the amount of nitrogen that's going into these waterways and causing environmental harms. So in my graduate work, I did study some different accidental wetland ecosystems. I'm happy to talk about that more if you're curious about what these accidental wetlands were and how they came about. But for the sake of time, I'll just go through some of the most interesting findings from that work. So I did find that indeed accidental wetlands, this is a site that was basically a brownfield. It had been a landfill for a while. It had these piles of fill debris and garbage. There was an underlying native soil layer beneath the garbage piles that occasionally peeked out between the garbage piles. And then there were these low-lying parts of the site that were permanently flooded and were sort of a mix of organic material from the plant community and the fill and debris that was sort of running off of these garbage piles. Amazingly, I found that the garbage piles had the highest rates of denitrification. They were doing extremely well. Again, I won't go into the explanation for that. I'm happy to talk about it more if people have questions. But basically, found a lot of evidence for accidental wetlands in the New York City metro area, providing very high rates of microbial denitrification, and in some cases, enough microbial denitrification, according to some back of the envelope modeling that I did, to remove the entirety of the nitrogen that was coming into the site via stormwater. I continued this work when I went to Phoenix, found some accidental wetlands in Phoenix as well, again on the bed of the Salt River. So here the stormwater pipe system exits into the dry bed of the Salt, and some of these pipes actually flow perennially. They support these wetland ecosystems throughout the year. They're kind of these long linear wetlands because it's along the bed of a river. But I did some sampling over the course of a few years, both at an upstream point and a downstream point in these wetlands, and was finding that in some of them we get 100% removal, even under storm conditions. So we see basically all of the nitrogen disappearing between the upstream and downstream point. This other accidental wetland is a little bit more variable in removal, but we do occasionally see 100% removed. So on the y-axis is the fraction of nitrate removed between upstream and downstream. And then I measured this both during base flow and storm flow conditions. So again, a lot of capability for removing nitrogen. And in Phoenix, where nitrate levels in the groundwater are extremely high, this is a potentially really valuable service that these accidental wetlands are providing. So when I got to New York City, I continued to find evidence of not only accidental wetlands, but features of like wetland features or organisms that were also kind of accidentally self-organizing in different areas. So I mentioned, for example, that the Billion Oyster Project is looking to restore 1 billion oysters to New York City waterways. Well, ribbed mussels are already restoring themselves to New York City waterways in the billions. And so I was really interested to come across these very, very large, robust ribbed mussels populations in these tidal creeks around New York City. So I did a lot of work with my students looking at what these ribbed mussel populations were doing in terms of mitigating water quality issues. We were also interested in stormwater infrastructure that was being deliberately introduced into some watersheds in New York City. So I mentioned Newtown Creek in an earlier slide where my student found that there was a lot of the majority of nitrogen was coming from the combined sewer overflow system and the treated the wastewater treatment plant. But in the watershed, there are all of these like stormwater infrastructure projects to reduce the amount of stormwater that's going into the combined sewer overflow system. So we were interested in the efficacy of those green infrastructure choices. There's also a lot of street trees that are being planted in that watershed, and there's plans for restoring a marsh in the creek. So this is a study that we did in Coney Island Creek, again, looking at denitrification rates in various types of habitats found around Coney Island Creek. So there's a restored marsh area. There's an accidental marsh that has emerged on a boat graveyard. The boat graveyard supports both these marshes and these very large ribbed mussel populations that have established there. And then there's also an these accidental marsh patches that have emerged on riprap. So this is unrestored, but the plants have started growing there, possibly from seeds that have blown in from the restored marsh. And we found again, that accidental blue infrastructure, so these self-established mussels and marsh grasses on the boat graveyards actually support higher nitrogen removal than the restored marsh areas. And so here we have denitrification rate on the y-axis and these different types of environments. So the boat graveyard, the beach, the riprap, and then there's also a restored oyster reef in the creek that BOP has put there, the Billion Oyster Project has put there, saw very low nitrogen removal around the oyster reef. However, so this is all exciting, that these accidental systems that are kind of emerging in urban environments actually have the potential to mitigate water quality problems. They're showing high removal rates, but again, to bring in that budgetary approach that I mentioned earlier, we tried to assess, like, is this a meaningful contribution? Is this a meaningful net benefit that these infrastructures are providing? And the answer is no, sadly. So this is a budget that was developed by two of my students, Tatiana and Tashina, in Coney Island Creek, looking at how much nitrogen was being removed by mussels and denitrified under the mussel beds, like on that boat graveyard, for example. And sadly, the inputs of nitrogen to that creek are absolutely dwarfing what is removed potentially from like by these mussel populations. And based on our surveys, we estimated, just in the area that we were surveying in the creek, we estimated 1 million rib mussels had self-established in the creek, and even that was not enough, like by a long shot, to remove the nitrogen that was coming into the creek from the combined sewer overflow and stormwater outfalls. In Newtown Creek, same thing. So I mentioned before that there's a lot of green infrastructure, a lot of stormwater infrastructure, street trees, bioswales, etc., that have been introduced to that watershed. This is the nitrogen load that was estimated by Paris, both with and without green infrastructure in the watershed. And you can see that it's exactly the same. The nitrogen load is basically identical, not statistically significantly different. When we account for the green infrastructure projects that have happened in the watershed and when we don't. So this is a little discouraging. Even though these types of nature-based solutions are demonstrating functionality, they're doing what we want them to do, the scale of implementation is just not sufficient to offset the pollution problems that are coming in. But again, I want to point out that there's not just one benefit or one ecosystem service that's provided by wetlands. And I think that it's important to note that if we are implementing nature-based solutions, that we be very precise and very explicit about what we want those environments to do. In other words, not overpromise that they are going to capture a lot of pollution when they're just not able to do that at that scale, but maybe there are other benefits that can be provided. So this was another study that was done by an undergraduate student of mine, Lacey Batros, where she was looking at accidental, restored, and created marshes in the Harlem River in New York City, and found that there was very large differences in native plant composition and biodiversity. So these three pie charts are showing the plant species composition in the restored, accidental, and constructed marsh. You can see the accidental marsh is 100% invasive, Phragmites australis, whereas the constructed marsh, which is like very highly maintained in terms of planting and pulling out invasives, has predominantly native species and is much more biodiverse. So these marshes are being managed to be biodiverse with native species, but what we also found was that they are sequestering the exact same amount of carbon. So I think this is an important thing to note. If the goal for wetland restoration is, for example, to buffer sea level rise or store carbon, maybe we can leave alone these environments that are accidentally formed but potentially dominated by invasive species. If the goal is restoring native marsh species, then it seems like it is useful to more actively manage those marshes. So I think it is important to be careful about what we want out of nature-based solutions and manage accordingly. So I want to talk finally about the work that I've done around uh, NBS justice issues and trying to examine the types of benefits that might emerge from nature-based solutions in urban waterways that are in underserved or marginalized communities. So this is work that I did with my colleague in the Harlem River and in Coney Island Creek, which are disproportionately elderly, foreign-born, and living in poverty. So these are very vulnerable communities within the New York City area. Um, and this was work that we did to really examine how urban waterways are and the nature-based solutions within them are really co-created by both the ecology of that system and humans. What we found is that the waterways that we're studying in New York, so the Harlem River and Coney Island Creek, are very heavily polluted with pathogens and nutrients. But again, and I mentioned this in an earlier slide, the observational studies and surveys that we conducted really demonstrated a lot of uses that put people into contact in the water, with the water. But the community also had a lot of strong cultural meanings and importance associated with the waterway. And so I think this again gets back to my very first slide about how the relationship between people and water is complicated. It's not enough to just deprive people. If a system is sufficiently polluted, we of course don't want people interacting with that waterway, but the fact of the matter is that they are interacting with that waterway, and it's very important and beneficial to them in many ways. And so how do we navigate that relationship better? And so to that end, and this is again another sort of extension adjacent activity that I was undertaking with my colleague in New York City, to again sort of make sure that that management and policy decisions around waterways are reflecting community uses, values, and desires. We conducted some social assessments in the communities on the Harlem River, using this sort of sidewalk science approach, where we were having the community rate which environments they connected with the most. So this was to inform a marsh restoration project that was proposed in this site, the Sherman Creek Park on the Harlem River. So we conducted this social assessment that revealed a desire by the community to know more about restoration efforts and ecology in the park. And so with our students, we developed these QR code signages for different areas of the park that were restored or unrestored to let the community know a little bit more about that environment. And then we also, as I said, conducted this sidewalk science surveying of the community to inform the restoration design of future marshes that were going into the park, to see what the community was responding to, what they wanted to see in their local park. So finally, along the same lines, I want to talk a little bit more about the work that I've done on whether nature-based solutions and how nature-based solutions provide ecosystem services or even disservices to vulnerable communities that experience environmental stressors. We see constantly the very close connection, the very intimate and needed connection that marginalized communities have with waterways. They don't have access to running water. They don't have access to centralized climate control. And these waterways and wetlands that they situate themselves next to are providing those things to them. So there's a very different swath of needs and relationships that are happening with certain communities and not others within the urban environment in terms of wetlands, waterways, etc. So this was work that I did in Phoenix as a postdoc. So I'll show this square over the next couple of slides to just sort of demonstrate the intersection of a couple of different conditions within the same area. So we have a disproportionately poor population of people living in downtown Phoenix. This same area is subjected disproportionately to heat-related illness and death. So we see heat vulnerability index higher there, as well as a higher number of deaths from heat in that centralized area. And this is very closely tied to not only the inability for residents in that area to afford air conditioning, but also the lack of green space in that part of the city. So in a desert city like Phoenix, vegetation costs money. And so if you can't spend the money on getting water in there to irrigate the landscape, then there's just not going to be any vegetation at all. So this is a land cover map. The black areas are impervious surfaces or concrete surfaces, and the green patches are green space, basically, or vegetation. So we can see very low vegetation. But what we also see is, again, that bed of the Salt River bisecting this area, and that's where those accidental wetlands are that are being sustained by the stormwater pipes in the city. So when I was going out to do my sampling for water quality, I would see bundles of stuff left by the water all the time. So I'd be running out there at 5 a.m. and to take my samples to beat the heat, and I would see, oh, someone was sleeping here. That totally makes sense. It's nice and cool down here. It's hidden. It's a much more inviting neighborhood than, for example, the homeless shelter nearby. So I'll show a photo of that in a moment. But so some colleagues of mine and I were interested in evaluating what types of ecosystem services were being provided to this unhoused population in Phoenix. And so, of course, we found that air temperature is on average 3 times higher than the water temperature in the wetlands. No surprise there. That's just basic physics. The water buffers temperature and it's cooler near water because of the evaporative cooling. But you'll recall from my earlier slide that this water is also very contaminated with E. coli, particularly during storm events. So if people are interacting with the water in ways that would expose them to E. coli, this is a potential problem. So we conducted surveys with unhoused people that we encountered in the area. We did some observational studies, but the unhoused population is a very difficult population to study for a number of reasons. There are a lot of vulnerabilities around mental illness, drug use, shame, the illegality of what they're doing. Outdoor camping is illegal in Phoenix. So in lieu of conducting a lot of interviews, which we only were able to do a handful, we actually did trash surveys in the area to try to infer what kinds of uses we were seeing in the wetlands, like how people were interacting with the water. And we did find a large number of trash items that suggested that people were ingesting the water and submerging themselves in it for bathing. So we found things like soap, toothpaste, there's a razor and a tube of toothpaste here. So definitely people are using this for running water, and some of the people that we interviewed did admit to occasionally drinking the water and bathing in it as well. So there are a lot of trade-offs that emerged in this study in terms of nature-based solutions, particularly for vulnerable populations. So Central Phoenix is disproportionately poor, hot, and lacking in green and blue infrastructure. This top photo is showing what a homeless shelter about a mile or maybe less away from the accidental wetlands looks like. You can see how much more inviting and enjoyable it would be to be able to camp out in this wetland environment instead of being in this homeless shelter. Heat stress, potable water scarcity, and lack of shelter are all posing serious risks to people experiencing homelessness in Phoenix. And accidental wetlands in Central Phoenix can provide services. So there's, heat mitigation that's being created in the wetlands, privacy, enjoyment, but there are some potential disservices, namely that people are using this as potable water, and it is not potable water, particularly during storms. So I continued this some similar work in those communities that I talked about earlier in the Harlem River and in Coney Island Creek, which again are disproportionately vulnerable. It's important to note that in New York City, there is not actually a lack of access to green space like we see in the Southwest. So 99% of residents in New York City live within a 10-minute walk of a park. There's abundant green space in New York City. However, not all green space is created the same. So in terms of the total amount of space per person that's available for these different green spaces, we see differences in neighborhoods of color, for example, versus white neighborhoods. So there's 51% more space per person in these more affluent areas and in white neighborhoods than in these more marginalized communities. So the quantity of green space or accessibility of green space isn't an issue. The quality of the green space is an issue, and the quantity. So we did studies in Coney Island Creek that found, again, this sort of heavy pollution, strong cultural meaning, a lot of uses that put people in contact with the water. But also, interestingly, a lot of capital improvement projects, like urban improvement projects, that were making the community more vulnerable. For example, in Coney Island Creek, there are these marsh restoration projects, but also they wanted to put in a ferry terminal that was going to disrupt the ability of the community to actually use the park and access the waterway in the ways that they were doing already. And we found this in Sherman Creek Park also. That this boathouse was going to go into the park, take up a significant proportion of the park. It was going to be operated by a private kayaking company. And so this could potentially disrupt the types of uses that the community was already using the waterway for. Sorry, I'm just going to blow through these slides because I'm almost out of time. Again, did a lot of engagement around this, not just identifying what some existing uses were prior to these development projects going in, but also trying to get information about how the community was using and valuing the waterways out to decision makers ahead of these projects so that they had that information about how the community was already utilizing the space and valuing it. So a number of reports to community organizations and managers, presentations to community boards, written testimony to the New York City Design Commission. But I think all of this work really highlighted the importance of formalizing the documentation of hidden uses of waterfronts in less conventional ways prior to or as part of the planning process. We may see these areas as just completely not valuable, derelict, in need of restoration or rehabilitation, but we are potentially overlooking the ways that communities are already utilizing these waterways. I don't know if I have time, but we did work, or I did work rather, in an urban park where that was in the planning stages. So I was very lucky to get in the early planning stages of development of this park. And what was unique about it was that that the community was already engaged, not just in the planning process, but in the actual design of the park. So we worked with groups of students at a nearby high school who were actually designing stormwater planters that were going to go into this park. And so I think this is a really important move from not just equity of access and quality of green space for communities, but actually inclusion of communities in the actual design and maybe even construction process of nature-based solutions. I have this quote here: cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. So here are some of the main takeaways: that nature-based solutions, even those that are degraded and have not been restored or designed, do support ecosystem services, but they can be paired with harms or disservices. Monitoring and budgets can help us determine the net benefit of nature-based solutions. Management goals for vulnerable populations may need to be different than the goals for the general population in terms of nature-based solutions. And it's really important to co-develop research and management of nature-based solutions with communities and managers. And some future work that I'm going to do in the area is going to be along the lines of landscape decision making. I would love to re-engage with the unhoused population and learn more about how they use and need waterways. And of course, a lot of issues around wastewater treatment and drinking water as well. So anyway, I'll end there. I'm sorry that I went a little bit long. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Palta. It was very informative. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know, don't worry about the time. We can have time for 1 or 2 questions. So yeah, I see hands up. Please go ahead, just ask. Thank you. Okay, I don't know. Hello, just ask the question. I think you can unmute yourself. Thank you. Okay, please go ahead. Okay, I just asked a question. I just had one in case somebody's waiting. So earlier you talked about people's perceptions, judging whether they can swim in water or not, based on what formed that decision process. Like, why did others feel they could swim in the water and others didn't? What information were they using to reach this issue?
Yeah, that was something unfortunately that we weren't able to dive into too much because this was like an anonymous survey basically. And so we did ask about water quality perceptions and then how frequently they engaged in certain activities. But we're still kind of working on, we did collect some demographic data for that survey as well. So I'm still kind of working on analyzing like whether there were like certain groups of people who tended to use the water more or not. Yeah, they were tending to use, actually one trend that did emerge was that, the majority of swimming is happening in the beach areas. And so maybe people just they sort of perceive the beaches as cleaner for some reason. But like they think of like New York City as polluted, but like the beaches like don't cause them as much concern because like maybe visually they're like more inviting for getting into the water. I don't know. That's just a hypothesis.
We have 3 more questions. Please go ahead. I think we can have Edith go first and Ben and Dr. Sabrina. Edith,
Great.
please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Monica. That was great. I really appreciate understanding more about your work. My question was, you mentioned that urban forests can contribute to nitrogen loading, and I was wondering, my mind went to, well, maybe that's a reason to plant more evergreen trees, and I'm just wondering if your research looked at, that as a potential sort of way around it, or what your thoughts might be about that as a potential solution.
That's so interesting. No, I hadn't thought about that. I know that and I haven't done, to be honest, I haven't done a lot of work with the street tree angle other than just mitigating like water. So like the leaf thing was, like I said, done in the Twin Cities. I think their primary management mechanism was more frequent street cleaning. So like they found like a really good, like sizable reduction in nutrient pollutant loading to the lakes when they were more frequently cleaning up the leaves. So like they got the city to clean up more frequently during the fall when the leaves were falling. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Ben Faber in Ventura. That was a fun talk you gave us.
Thank you.
One of the things that Orange County is famous for, at one point, it was the most economically productive county in the whole of the United States. So there's a lot of remnant. I mean, up until about even 20 years ago, there were strawberries and all kinds of stuff being grown down there intensively. So my question is, how much of the current landscape of urbanization impacts the pollution versus the remnant contaminants that occurred from agriculture over 100 years? Is
Oh,
one more
yeah.
important now than the other?
That's a great question. And again, like I'm more recent to this area. What I learned recently, because I was touring the wastewater treatment plant here, is that there's a long legacy of nutrient additions to the soils here. And there's a very shallow clay layer in the watershed. So when homeowners are irrigating, even if they are not actively applying fertilizers themselves, the legacy nutrients in the soil are getting entrained into the irrigation water and coming out during like dry weather flows, basically. I mean, certainly in New York City, where I was working before, it's a lot of it is legacy pollutants, mostly heavy metals from industry, for example. So that's kind of like a big pollution problem. And then of course they have this like ancient treatment system. In Orange County, though, they have they're very actively treating their water. I mean, they're very on top of water treatment, it seems. So yeah, so that's very impressive that they're capturing, you know, basically a lot of the dry weather flow, and going sort of above and beyond with wastewater treatment. So yeah, I don't 100% know the answer to your question, but I've certainly heard about legacy pollutants being a problem in the watersheds here. But a lot of them are being treated for, which is kind of cool.
Hey, Monica. I just wanted to note that, and you may be familiar with some of E.D. Allen's work on this, but there's also a lot of aerial deposition throughout
Oh,
all of
interesting.
Southern
Okay.
California, but definitely throughout Orange County, like really high nitrogen levels, like application level nitrogen levels. They've
Thank you
found
for telling me. I
in
didn't know.
grasslands. Yeah, she's done a lot of
Yeah.
work in grasslands in Riverside County.
Okay. Okay.
Have looked at that. I don't know a lot about the other elements in there, but presumably anything that could be associated with car traffic could be there.
Yeah, that's great to know. I'll look into that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about fishing.
Okay.
So that's something that I did a lot of research on in the Los Angeles watershed. I joined late. I apologize. So I don't know if you mentioned it a lot. Certainly in the Hudson, Harlem, and East Rivers, there's a lot of fishing activity.
Yes,
I
yes,
was
there
just
is.
curious if you know, sort of what you'd seen or noticed as you're starting to get used to the Santa Ana.
So I haven't again, I haven't been here long enough, unfortunately, to make a ton of observations. I definitely like anecdotally have seen people fishing in waterways here. Certainly in New York, though, it's a huge problem, and not only and I'd be curious to know if this kind of activity is happening here in Southern California as well, like in LA, for example. But in New York City, we did have some anecdotal evidence that people were actually harvesting shellfish and fish and selling them in fish markets in Queens.
Yeah,
So
we
is that happening
definitely
here
had a lot
too?
of we had a lot of anecdotal evidence of it from lakes in LA County and in
Okay.
LA City,
Okay.
especially right after they would stock a lake.
Yeah, yeah.
That you know that something non-Vietnamese fishers would always say that the Vietnamese folks had come in with nets and like just taking everything out the night
Similar
after.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, similar to Coney Island, where they were saying that like, yeah, that like, yeah, people of East Asian descent were.
Yeah,
um,
I'll send you information. I've got a pretty extensive
okay,
literature on
yeah,
fishing
that would
in the
be,
LA River. And
yeah.
I also just want to point out my co-author, my sort of frequent collaborator on a lot of this, Jason Post. He kind of pioneered in his dissertation, using just sort of crowdsourcing information mainly from YouTube, but also from other sources, because people are constantly doing little
Interesting.
videos about what they're catching. So there's really quite a lot of data. And we also certainly found that fish are a really important protein resource, especially for the unhoused community in the LA River. And I suspect in other
Super
watersheds throughout
interesting.
Southern California.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I love that idea of crowdsourcing. That we were like, do we like, could we use isotopes to trade? Like we were like trying to figure out if there was like maybe a signature associated with like different waterways. Yeah, that's super interesting. I
Yeah,
think
we
like
should
using
definitely talk offline, because there's also been a lot of interesting research done in the LA using eDNA.
Okay, yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely. I would love to chat more about that. That was something that we didn't get around to doing it in New York, and I was really disappointed about that, because it's like, yeah, I mean the levels of heavy metals and other contaminants in the fish tissue must be like, and like especially the filter feeders has to be astronomical, and there's basically no signage around these waterways either detracting anyone from fishing. So they're just sort of like,
yeah,
pregnant women should be careful, and that's
and there
like a
is
little dinky sign like tucked out,
yeah,
and one sign in all of Coney Island Creek. Yeah.
and their California Department of Health does have required obligations for signage that they don't necessarily always fulfill.
Yeah, I would love to chat more about that.
I don't know if we have time for one last thing. Thanks so much for that talk. I was curious, I'm really interested in how our increasing water conservation, both regulations and just consciousness, are going to be impacting accidental wetlands and ecosystem services, and any thoughts you had on that front.
Sorry, say that one more time. So what kind of impact what would have on accidental ecosystems? Sorry.
Water conservation in urban areas, because a lot of our wetlands are kind of fueled through like, stormwater outflows that people are, overwatering their yards, and it goes in. And
that is such a good question. Actually, again, like I don't know if I have time, but I actually included some slides on this because I've been interested in exactly that question. So I'll just quickly share this. So this was work that that I did in sorry. I know the window's probably small again, right? So this was work that I did with my colleague in Phoenix. So these are different pipes that go into the Salt River, and you can see like 3 of them. So basically, like when a line is here, it means the pipe is on, and when it's missing, it's off. And this is the precipitation record. So you can see like these perennial pipes are flowing even when it's not raining. These intermittent pipes are flowing when it's raining, and then sometimes in between as well. And then the ephemeral ones are only flowing when it rains. So those are like probably 100% stormwater, and these other ones are like that urban base flow or dry flows that you were talking about. And we actually found that, again, this is denitrification rates. So the perennial the perennial wetlands that had the pipes that were flowing all the time had the highest rates of denitrification. And then we even had a difference in what was more limiting, like nitrogen or carbon, between like these. So definitely, if Phoenix becomes more like water conservative, not only are the accidental wetlands potentially going to be lost, but they might change significantly in their plant community and functionality as well. So, so yeah, I think that's a really important thing to examine, is like, it's, we want to be conserving water, but are we depriving potential ecosystems that are providing other kinds of benefits that we want of water? Like, you need to make sure that those, and especially the accidental wetlands, because they're not planned for or known about a lot of the time. So we don't even know potentially what habitat we're destroying or what ecosystems we're destroying by being more conservative with our water use. Yeah, that's a great question. I've been very curious about that myself.
I just wanted to throw in there that in the LA, there's been a lot of work done on water budgets because most of the flow in the LA River is not urban runoff. It's treated wastewater from water reclamation plants. And so it's not so much water conservation that's the issue. There's now really a big market for purple pipe water for residential irrigation. And so basically the LA is almost over allocated or could hit being over allocated because of that. But oh shoot, sorry, there was something I wanted to say. Oh, we actually, I was an advisor on it, but SCORP did an environmental flow assessment for the LA River.
Oh,
and they may have done one for the Santa Ana as well. And Joanna, if you're not familiar with that, environmental flows are sort of the terms used in like hydropower projects, and you know how much flow you need to keep in the river to support
the
habitat.
ecosystem. Yeah. What's interesting about the Salt River also is that because it was dug down so deeply, and there was so much industrial activity in the area, like the soils are compacted enough, and there was like there was landfill there as well, so there's like a fill lay, or sorry, like a clay lens that was put into the soil profile. So that's what allows the wetlands to stay perched on the top. And I know in the LA River, they're planning on, they've already removed a lot of the concrete lining in the channel. So I don't know if there's concerns also over infiltrating the water too fast.
Have not so much removed concrete lining in the channel. There's just a lot of study in areas that were never lined. Because the water table is so high. Sorry, I can text you about the other.
And we'll chat later
sometime.
In terms of the question asked in the chat, that it is mostly separate. They don't have combined sewer in Orange County. But I think there are combined sewer systems in other parts of, I think in LA County, there are some places where there's combined sewer. I could be wrong about that. Oh yeah, maybe San Francisco, maybe only San Francisco. I could be wrong.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your talk certainly drew a lot of interest, which is always good. I'm sure a lot of people will reach out to you. We'll post this out on the ANR website. I'll send you a link. Once again, thanks a lot for accepting to give this talk.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to chat with everybody further. So excited to be here.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.